actually know this guy that's doing this seminar.
We'll wait a few minutes because I don't think the speaker is here yet. So let's just give him a few minutes.
Hello.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining this seminar today. It's a great pleasure to have Dr. Sacoby Wilson with us today, speaking on his research on environmental justice during the syndemic of SARS-CoV-2 and systemic racism. Dr. Wilson is very well known for his work in this area. He's in environmental health science and an associate professor at the University of Maryland College Park. He has a great deal of expertise in environmental justice, science, environmental health disparities, environmental racism, air pollution monitoring, built environment, climate change, CAFOs, water quality monitoring, community-based participatory research, citizen science, community science and resiliency, and community university partnerships. He's the former chair of the APHA environmental section, and he's a member of the National Environmental Justice Council and a member of the National Academy of Sciences Board on Environmental Studies and Toxicology. And that's actually where I met Dr. Wilson. He's also co-founded the DMV EJ Coalition and 17 for Peace Justice. He's won several awards, including the Damu Smith Award and the new NCEJ Network Steve Wing International Environmental Justice Award for his leadership. And so I think we're very fortunate to be able to sponsor him in our department, and also co-sponsor with the department's DEI committee. So welcome, Dr. Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you. So I was transitioning from we had a class today at 11 o'clock. So squeezing too much in one day. So thank you, Dr. Barr, for that great introduction. Really happy to be here today virtually with those of you who are at Emory and other parts of the country, possibly. Before I get started, I want to just acknowledge, do a land acknowledgement for the Scataway folks, is where we are at University of Maryland, indigenous people, so we wouldn't be here without them, without their sacrifice. So I want to respect and acknowledge that. I want to do a share screen and talk about my work and sort of my perspectives on where we are. And hopefully y'all can be patient with me as I walk you through this. We talk about, I am environmental science, as Dr. Barr said, but I really want to talk about the syndemic. What's a syndemic? Syndemic is multiple pandemics. It's I've been dealing with coronavirus, and many folks have been impacted by it. But I think before we kind of get to that pandemic, and those individuals have been disproportionately impacted by it, we should talk about the syndemic and other pandemics. So we have a pandemic of racism. That's an obvious one. Systemic racism, structured inequality related to it. Racism as American as apple pie. We have, in many ways, we have two Americas: the multicultural America, the America with equal opportunity for all, where we can have President Obama, Vice President Kamala Harris, and then we have America with white supremacists, fascists who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. We have an America where folks of color are dehumanized and less valued because of their skin color. We have an America with structured violence against young women of color, whether it be the young girl was recently pepper sprayed or the young lady was body slammed by a resource officer. We have an America where people of color, trans folks are murdered daily. We have America with gun violence in certain communities. We have America where George Floyd, Arbery, Breonna Taylor can be shot and killed without any real justice, or it could be a knee on the neck for 8 minutes and 32 seconds. Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, y'all know the names, y'all know the faces, y'all know the stories. We have a movement, a Me Too movement, which says, say her name right. I want to add today, when we talk about these issues, we remember these faces. And when I talk about environmental justice, we need to remember those communities, say their names. Now I'll do that part of this lecture. So you got this structural violence, right? Over policing, police brutality, over sentencing, Black faces, white spaces. When people feel like they can just call the police on you because you don't supposedly live in this neighborhood, you don't drive a Mercedes, you shouldn't be birding in this park with me. That's part of this structured violence. We cannot talk about environmental health. We cannot talk about community health and public health without talking about structured violence, right? Racism is a public health issue. We cannot talk about environmental health without talking about racism. We cannot talk about public health and environmental health without talking about underlying vulnerabilities, social, economic vulnerabilities. We talk about, so you have a pandemic of racism, you have a pandemic of COVID-19. Y'all know the stats, y'all know the numbers. These stats are actually a bit dated now. But disparities in mortality across different racial ethnic groups. You know how COVID-19 has impacted our indigenous brothers and sisters. COVID-19 has made visible populations and policies have made invisible, whether it be the frontline healthcare workers, whether it be the retail workers, the transit workers, whether it be the folks the brothers and sisters at migrant workers who pick our food, right? Whether it be the meatpacking workers, the folks that are in prison or who work in prisons, the folks that work in the nursing homes. COVID-19 has made visible those populations that are policy made visible. What do I mean by that? We talk about, good personal hygiene, washing our hands. We have indigenous brothers and sisters, look at the Navajo Nation. Folks don't have access to potable water. Folks who live in those camps that pick our fruits and vegetables, they don't have access to safe potable water. Folks who live in the colonias on the border, the U.S.-Mexico border, they don't have access to publicly regulated sewer water infrastructure, so they can't wash their hands. You heard of Catherine Flowers in Alabama, her story about, we got hookworm in the U.S., right? Hookworm, that's not a water issue, that's a sewer issue. People don't have access to sewer. They cannot deal with their waste, right? That's a public health issue. So we have people in this country who don't have access to basic human rights. You should have a human right to clean air. You should have a human right to clean water. You should have a human right to safe sewer, to deal with waste management, right? So COVID-19 has made those populations more visible, right? The same people who've been disproportionately impacted by the virus, SARS-CoV-2 virus, right? Whether it be, morbidity and mortality. Think about the economic crisis. It's the same communities. You think about climate change. Y'all seen this visual before. Global North, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, disproportionately impact the global South. That's the same thing in the US. You got certain folks who are socially, economically vulnerable when it comes to climate-related perturbations, whether it be flooding, droughts, forest fires, right? Flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes. Who are those folks? So the folks who are most vulnerable economically, socially, they may live near hazards, live in the floodplain. They're gonna always get hit first, worse than most by climate-related perturbations. So hurricanes. You know, last year, the 50th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. Remember, 2020 had more named storms in the history of naming storms. We went to the Greek alphabet. I should remember the Greek alphabet because I'm a member of a fraternity, right? But we went high up in the Greek alphabet. I think the Gulf Coast had 7 named storms. So remember Katrina hit it in the August, right? People hadn't been paid yet. New Orleans is a great place culturally, but also New Orleans is highly segregated with a lot of poverty. So if you're hit at the end of the month, you hadn't been paid yet. How are you supposed to get out of Katrina, out of New Orleans, pre-Katrina? We don't have any money in your savings account. When you're low income, you don't have a car. So when you think about the vulnerabilities that folks have to climate change, heat islands. Why do we have heat islands across the country? Shondas and others have done studies on heat islands, right? And shown that through the redlining, you have 8-degree differences in temperatures in non-redline versus redline areas. What's redlining? Where certain communities, right? People color, hey, you can't get a loan. You're not gonna be able to get a home loan. We're gonna redline you. We don't believe you have the ability to pay this loan back. So it's racism in getting housing, getting home loans. And then this other communities get color green. You know, more white, oh, we believe you can pay this loan back. So people weren't able to get this American dream. Think about the wealth gap in this country. How do we build wealth tradition in this country? Home ownership. So bias and discrimination, racism in FHA and HOLC limited the opportunity structure for folks to buy homes. But also say communities that are redlined, these are also say communities that were not able, you had lack of municipal services. And then all of a sudden in the 60s and 70s, we talk about urban renewal. We're gonna revitalize urban communities. What did that mean for Black and brown communities? Other people of color communities? It was something different. It's a different experience. It led to many of those communities having highways and byways built through them. So know anything about the National Highway Defense Act. Think about, you know, this whole integration, the civil rights movement fighting for equal access, equal opportunity, integration. You had a lot of integration, okay? You had a lot of white flight communities. So you look at this redlining, heat islands. We know with climate change, you're going to see temperature increases over time. You have more impervious surfaces. You have lack of access to tree canopy. Like places like Baltimore, people don't have air conditioning. So last year was the 25th anniversary of the Chicago heat waves. So again, you see the intersection of race, vulnerability, playing a role in who's impacted more by heat islands, who's impacted more by heat waves. Heat waves are held for the poor and the elderly. In DC, in Baltimore, we saw high rates of mortality from heat last year and in previous years. And in our state of Maryland, a lot of those heat-related deaths are occurring in Baltimore where people, you have a lot of older housing without air conditioning, without tree canopy, with a lot of impervious surfaces. So this is an environmental justice issue. This is a climate justice issue. So we talked about, you know, racism as a pandemic, right? Coronavirus as a pandemic, climate change as a pandemic. You have environmental injustice, environmental pollution as a pandemic. And I made this comment earlier about structural violence, right? Structural violence. To me, the police brutality, police states of communities of color, the over-policing, the over-sentencing, this whole phenomena of Black faces, white spaces, to me, it's all connected. And so if you look at, you know, the environmental justice movement, you look at the environmental justice movement, I think it speaks to that a little bit. So Dr. King, remember he was assassinated 53 years ago in Memphis. working with the sanitation workers who were dealing with issues of what? Not being treated fairly, not being paid fairly, dealing with poor working conditions. So think about the environmental justice movement. It's a movement where folks are looking at these issues of public health justice, economic justice, right? Health justice. And so for me, if you look at the sign that you see in the upper right-hand corner is being carried, I am a man. I think my point I'm trying to make is, and I made my points earlier about structural violence against communities of color. I am a man, recognize my humanity. So we're not recognizing humanity in these communities. So whether it be individuals who've been murdered or not just getting the benefit of the doubt, right? This black faces, white spaces phenomenon, or reproductive justice issues, y'all. I mean, or even the issue of women of color, Black women having 4 times the, mortality rate of white women during childbirth, one of your most vulnerable times in your life where you should get the most protection. Racism, raises ugly head. That's the only thing that could really be the why. Why is that rate so high? It's not genetics. That's something inherently wrong with those women when they're pregnant. It's because of their experience getting care or not getting the appropriate care when they're delivering a baby. So the environmental justice movement is a movement, you think about that structural violence, it's really against structural violence. It's fighting for human rights, the right to clean air, the right to clean water, the right to safe housing, right? It's a movement fighting against the disproportionate burden of environmental hazards and locally wanted land uses. Petrochemical operations that you see in Cancer Alley in Louisiana, right? Refineries that's also in Cancer Alley or the Houston Ship Channel or in Richmond, California. Industrial chicken farms in Maryland, Delaware, Virginia. Industrial hog farms in North Carolina. Power plants that you see strewn about the place, but if you look at NAACP's work, those power plants are disproportionately found in communities of color. Paper mills, concrete plants, any use where it's pollution intensive, where it's emissions to the air, water, and soil that can impact human health. Why do those uses tend to disproportionately be in communities of color and low wealth communities? In communities with limited political power. Structural racism is part of the problem, but also structural poverty. That's intersectionality there. So the communities that have less economic power have less political power. You have this phenomenon called not in my backyard. But a lot of people who have wealth are able to push for that, to fight against these facilities, not in their backyard. But Dr. Bullitt says, PIBI, put in Blacks' backyards. So a lot of Blacks, sometimes it's income related, but a lot of Blacks are in poverty, have limited economic power, political power, they get these facilities. So these communities tend to end up being sacrifice zones. You think about the work in Warren County with the landfill fight, where Dr. Chavis coined the term environmental racism. You can think about environmental racism in the siting of these hazards, these facilities, right? And you think about Flint, Michigan as an example of environmental racism. All they had to do was what? Was comply with the lead and copper rule. What happened in Flint wouldn't happen in Ann Arbor. And you see now that the former governor at the time has been indicted. There's some public health officials that have been indicted. Some officials from Region 5, EPA Region 5, they've been indicted. Those deaths from Legionella, those deaths from lead exposure, and those children who've been impacted long-term from lead exposure, that's on their hands. So, the definition of environmental justice. I'm not a big fan of this first definition. It's the kumbaya definition. It's the all lives matter definition. Let me be a little bit more controversial. This ain't controversial. Let me talk about Black Lives Matter real quick. Black Lives Matter sounds much better than Black Lives Matter too, okay? So just want to say that for everybody. It's the fair treatment, meaning involvement of all people, right, regardless of race, ethnicity, culture, when it comes to respect to the implementation of laws and regulations. Okay, fine. But as I just said with Flint, we know that's not happening, that the laws are not being enforced in every case. We know there's inequities in who's making decisions. We know there's not representative voices when it comes to zoning boards and town councils making decisions. We know that in many cases, even when you have a law on the books, folks, doesn't mean it's going to protect the most vulnerable, most susceptible person. I like to say the Clean Air Act, it does a great job protecting the most susceptible population, or person is not protecting the most vulnerable and most susceptible. It's not protecting poor children. Because if it was, for those who know the Clean Air Act, that language text on prevention of significant deterioration, that would have been applied. Why hasn't Title VI been enforced by the EPA? Why hasn't Title VI been enforced by state regulatory agencies? The disparate impact clause. If we really enforce all rules and regulations, we shouldn't have environmental justice. If we really enforce Title VI, we shouldn't have environmental justice. If we really took into account equity and justice and really took the precautionary principle that's supposedly embedded in our environmental regulations, we wouldn't have environmental justice. Just read the book Color Law. The second definition is coined by Bunyan Bryant, and this is really a public health definition. Those of you who are in public health, environmental justice is serving people realize the highest potential experience of the isms. Let's look at this, people. Decent paying and safe jobs. Jobs, quality schools and recreation, decent housing, social terms of health, adequate healthcare, social terms of health, communities free of drugs and violence and crime, social terms of health and poverty. We're talking about social terms of health. Think about COVID-19 again. Comorbid conditions. Well, the reason why more people die, people call it die because of underlying comorbid conditions. Oh, why is that? Oh, because they're diet and lifestyle. Diets and lifestyles are not occurring in the vacuum, folks. Place matters, context matters. Your zip code is more important than genetic code. You don't have access to grocery stores, to supermarkets. You don't have access to pedestrian infrastructure, walking trails, or bike trails. If you don't have access to mass transit that allows you to get to a place with healthy foods, that's going to impact your diet and your lifestyles. So again, context matters, place matters. Environmental justice is just not about biological diversity, right? It's about cultural diversity. I mean, it's important, going back to my point about structural violence and humanity. If we put the value and respect the human life like we respect our own life, and respect the other people's lives in the same way, and respected Black and Indigenous people colors lives in the same way, I don't think we would have this conversation today about environmental justice. I think we'd be having this conversation today about environmental racism. And I don't think we would have the phenomena of environmental slavery, where some communities are used to host locally wanted land uses. They don't get the benefits. They internalize the social externalities, the health externalities, the environmental externalities, right? The economic externalities. So pollution is being produced, right? And so think about when you have a highway go through someone's community and you're burning fossil fuels, whether it be diesel, gasoline. What do you get? You get combustion byproducts. Where do those combustion byproducts go? Well, yeah, Dr. Wilson, they go into the trees, they go into the ground, they go in the soil. If I live in a community, it also goes to my body. So you're using my sink, my body as a sink for pollution. If someone's a pregnant mother in that community, they've been exposed to combustion byproducts that are basically potentially killing that developing fetus. I'm gonna say it again, potentially killing or having deleterious, long-term deleterious effects on development of that fetus. That's environmental slavery. Let me just slow down. Just want y'all to just take that in. Power plants, cluster of power plants, a cluster of super polluters, a cluster of hog farms, a cluster of chicken farms. Where do you think those pollutants go? Feed and transport, they break down, they go long range. If you live close to it, if you're hosting it, think about the cumulative exposures. Those of you from health science, cumulative exposures, cumulative effects of living near a cluster of industrial facilities. That community is a sacrifice zone. It's a dumping ground. Scientifically, though, and Dr. Barr, her great work knows this. Think about biomonitoring, the pollutants the chemicals that absorb into the body. Even the case of lead and Flint, right? Even if you move out of Flint, think about folks who left Flint. We store lead where? In our bones. If you're a pregnant mother, what happens during pregnancy? That lead is re-released. So that fetus has been exposed to lead. So one of the things I like to say when I do these keynotes, these speeches, how are you gonna put America first and put your kids first? We have too many kids who are living in toxic environments. So if you look at the whole life cycle, right? These windows of susceptibility, one of the most important windows is when the fetus is in the womb developing, right? Also, when you have these infants that are living in toxic environments, hand-mouth behavior, they can be exposed to lead paint, lead through lead paint, right? Because it's sweet. Think about that. We have children who Now, pre-pandemic, children of color were disproportionately riding school buses. Diesel exhaust has, major effects on human health. Diesel exhaust itself can cause short-term impacts, include burning the eyes, nose, and throat, right? But also can mess with your concentration, your coordination, your focus. So we're sending children to school on buses. They're being exposed to that plume while on the bus. They may be walking by the bus to school, or the buses might be idling, or the buses are idling and you have intrusion inside indoors, right? How, again, we expect children to reach their full potential if they've been exposed to toxins like diesel exhaust, or lead, or particulate matter, volatile organic compounds, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or they may live in poor housing stock, right? Where they're exposed to mold, mildew, and allergens. They may be exposed to pests, off-gassing of VOCs, through glues and adhesives, or exposed to flame retardants. This is what children are exposed to. It gets at the cumulative exposure. So environmental justice as a social movement is important to recognize. But as a science, we're talking about differential and maximum exposure to multiple toxicants that can impact human health. That just doesn't cause asthma, right? But can cause other effects. Mutate DNA can impact reproduction. I mean, I think we have a reckoning, and I'm gonna get to that reckoning. I need to speed up a little bit. When it comes to the science that we do, one of the questions is science the key? I think science, we haven't done enough. I want to say it before I run out of time, because I'm going a little too slow today. Science hasn't done enough. Exposure science hasn't done enough to help elucidate these problems and help address these problems. So I already talked about environmental racism. I'll skip that slide. Y'all know this picture from Toxic Waste and Race, and also Dr. Bullitt's book, Death and Dixie. I talked about this already, but when I think about environmental justice, the three-legged stool, been overburdened, high concentration psychosocial stressors, and then lack of access to salutogenic infrastructure. Okay, so y'all know the term salutogenesis. If you don't know Antonovsky, how you promote health and wellness across all the environment. Physical, the built, natural, economic, political, social, and spiritual environment. So when we think about public health, we become, I think, maybe I'm broad brushing, I think we become more too reductionist in our work. And Antonovsky is like, how do you promote wellness and health and quality of life? What's right with us? Do science is what's right with us? Positive exposures, resiliency, right? Not doing something what's wrong with us all the time. And so, what can we do? I mean, I do a lot of community-engaged research. I think it's important that we engage those who are on the front line of fence line. We engage those who are most impacted by these issues to inform the science. I think, and I'll get into this, and this is a key issue for me as a scientist. I don't think we're doing enough to really come up with questions that make sense, that are spatially resolved, that are informed by communities, right? So if you think about community engagement, you got this continuum. As you move from left to right, communication increases, trust increases, partnerships increase, and hopefully impact also increases. So outreach, a lot of us do outreach, right? And we're providing materials to a community group. That's one directional. You're not really getting feedback. Consultation becomes more bi-directional, right? Community involvement is when you have a community advisory board. And to me, the gold standards are participatory research and community-driven research. So participatory research would be something like community-based participatory research, which I will get into. But if you think about when you want to work with communities, you have to have relationships, y'all. So think about the characteristics of great relationships. What do you have? You got communication, you got transparency, you got trust, you got some Aretha Franklin. You got to have respect, y'all. So two core for me are trust and respect. And those ingredients of really good relationships provide the foundation for strong partnerships, okay? So you have CVPR, right? So communities engage in all stages of the research process. Developing the questions, study design, what methods you use to collect data, analysis plan, maybe doing analysis too, helping with dissemination, and translating that data to action. So to me, I think it's still pretty novel, maybe cutting edge, but I think we're not engaged in communities. We're really not doing good science. That's just me. That's where I'm at right now. Let me just be honest and open with y'all. I do liberation and empowerment science. Science to me that just studies problems is not good enough. I'll get to that later on. It's problematic. But you got to work with those who are the front line offense line. But Dr. Ms. McLean, who I work with in Savannah, Georgia, she says that, and y'all should know Dr. McLean, since y'all at Emory. She says that, Sacoby, I'm the true subject matter expert. The folks that live in the community are, because we live it with every day. And I agree with her. I have general knowledge. Y'all know Bayesian terms. This is Bayesian term for y'all. Specificatory knowledge. Folks who live in the front line offense line, who live in these impact communities, they have specificatory knowledge. I live in Bowie, Maryland. I live in the food oasis. I don't have any EJ issues. I have a little bit of air pollution. I mean, I know about EJ, but I don't live with it every day. I'm not experiencing that plume, that diurnal variation. What hog farm with certain gases at night in the morning time I'm being exposed to, and certain gases at nighttime. I don't know that. I'm not living near a fracking site. And y'all know the experience that people experience with people who live near fracking sites. They know that. They know the exposures. I don't live near a landfill. The episodic nature of the exposure to various gases, or a paper mill. Y'all know paper mills are I'm about to say funky, but very odoriferous, right? Or a sewage treatment plant. People who live near those facilities, they know even when someone's gas flaring at a facility, they know the sound of a particular alarm. They know when there's gas flaring happening. They know when a certain plume occurs. They know when that kid has a little asthma attack, or their throat starts to itch, or their eyes start to burn. They know that intimately. That's contextual knowledge. That's contextual expertise. We have to uplift and value community and cultural knowledge systems more than we do currently in science. And CBPR is still fringe. CBPR should not be fringe. It should be the gold standard in any school of public health, in any university that you're engaged community. This type of participatory action research, street science, whatever you want to call it, should be the gold standard. You got to do partnerships, have to be authentic. You have to have quality processes, right? Sometimes that's baggage. You have to have meaningful outcomes. This is not good enough to have process. Did you improve the air quality? Did you reduce health disparities? Did you reduce the hazard? Did you reduce the exposures, right? I mean, for me, you got to think about, okay, processes. A lot of communities have baggage when it comes to universities. So a lot of science in the past has been extractive. It's been helicopter science. I wrote a blog on Medium, talked about scientific racism, scientific colonialism, scientific imperialism. A lot of science is too extractive, y'all. I'm gonna tell y'all something. We're at the point in time in the history of this country, even though air quality is improved with the EPA, with Clean Air Act and other things, we still have hot spots. We still have sacrifice zones. We the communities in Atlanta, near 85. Y'all know the communities with all the traffic, with all the pollution. I know a little bit about Atlanta. I lived in Atlanta before. I went to college in Huntsville, Alabama, so I drove to Atlanta a lot. The communities in Atlanta that have poor infrastructure, poor built environment, poor social environment, a lot of clustering of fast food restaurants, liquor stores, payday lenders, and then they have disinvestment, divestment. You have urban sort of like breakdown. You have some violence and crime issues. Then you have pollution exposures, or you have poor housing quality, right? You have lack of tree canopy. You have stormwater issues. Those are all EJ issues. You have gentrification. That's an EJ issue. Those communities. How are we helping to empower those communities? Do science. How are we helping to transform those communities, right? How are we doing research that transforms us, that leads to community transformation? How we build community capacity? How we should have social justice at the core of what we do when it comes to science. I do science for the people. I do science for social justice. I do science for change. With Dr. Wilson, that doesn't sound that objective. I'm gonna get to that, objectivity. Whose knowledge counts? Whose questions count? It all gets to me power control. And that to me is the reason why we haven't seen science having more impact on these issues, right? I come from a community where I grew up near a landfill, near a sewage treatment plant, near a major highway, near a concrete rock rubble kind of place, like, Fred Flintstone, old school folks, y'all know Fred Flintstone, like a little rubble place. My dad was a pipe fitter, worked at the nuclear power plant, Grand Gulf, 20 miles down the road, right? Worked at power plants. My dad, when I was working on a report on looking at the public health impacts of fracking in Maryland, I was in West Virginia interviewing folks. That's where my dad was. My dad was West Virginia, at a man camp, building a pipeline. So yes, my dad has built some of these pollution-intensive facilities, but my dad also has asbestosis, right? So I had that personal experience. This is the reason why I do EJ work. But I want to talk about Boyer real quick and get back to my point about objectivity. Boyer talks about scholarships of inquiry, integration, teaching, engagement, application. Inquiry, discovery science. We focus way too much on discovery science and academia. And I tell my colleagues, I tell the students, if you're just doing discovery science and you're not doing all 5 dimensions, you're doing incomplete science. We've over-commodified, over-incentivized discovery science. Communities are tired of just being studied, y'all. They're tired of it. They want application and action. They want practice. Let me ask y'all at Emory, do you have practice in your team promotion guidelines? We don't have it in Maryland, so you know. We don't have it in Maryland. I know George Washington has it. Why is it important? At the core of public health is solving problems, working with legislators, solutions. That should be actually valued more than other types of science, in my opinion. Solution science, okay? Well, if you over-commodified it, publish or perish. Let me tell y'all something. Publication is about you. That's about changing your pocket. That's not about changing the community. Which say, Dr. Wilson, that's not right. I mean, my job is to publish, and it goes out in the journal, and then the policymakers take it. Why aren't you taking the information to the policymakers? Publications does not science communication make. You got to be writing briefs. You got to be doing infographics. You got to be doing maps, right? You got to be doing tweeting. You got to be doing Facebook. You got to be TikToking. You got to be getting the science into the hands of the people the ways they get it. 15-second, 30-second elevator speech for a policymaker or community member. Your publication is not 15-second or 30-second elevator speech. It's your job to do that. But unfortunately, we haven't commodified and incentivized it. But I don't have a choice to do that, okay? A lot of faculty of color are trying to do this work. And I said all faculty of color are trying to do this work. And they got a PhD in academia to do science that's about impact and social change. But many of us are doing that work. But that work has not been fully valued. So you think about diversity, equity, inclusion, we need to value impact science. We need to value science that's solving problems. We need to value science more about action. And we need to stop putting so much value on discovery because that's extractive. And that's what I call pain pipping science. It's macabre, y'all. I'm gonna slow down for y'all. It's macabre for us to be studying folks who are dealing with these environmental health problems and not solving the problem. Y'all know chemistry. Go back to stoichiometry. Balance that equation out. You're studying the problem. What have you actually done to improve their health, to improve air quality? Well, that's not my job. You choose to do that. And you've been incentivized to do that. You haven't been held accountable for doing science that's extractive. Is that focus on action? So my question is science the key? It can be the key. But let me go back in history for y'all real quick. I wish I had another hour to talk about this so I can preach to y'all about this science. There's been science that's been in this country that's been focused on racial and biological exploitation of people of color. Not just Tuskegee, not just sterilization of women of color, from Black women to the women of Venezuela, not just the father gynecology working on enslaved African women. We have HeLa cells, the Johns Hopkins, Kennedy Krieger lead study. We can go on and on and on about pain pimping, extractive, exploitive science. That's why folks of color don't trust science. That's why folks of color worry about the vaccine, because the history of being misused by science and scientists. Science is an end. It is not a means. The end has to be social justice, public health, social change. We got to have more scientists that look like the folks on the front on the fence line. We have to make sure to understand that science is for everyone. We have to make science everyday, pocketbook, and proximal. I'm telling y'all right now, everyone on this planet is a scientist. You know why? Almost everyone on this planet is a scientist. We're using this laptop right now. That's applied science. When you put on your clothes, you wearing science. When you turn on your TV, you just turn on science. When you turn your lights, that's science. When you drive your car, that's science. The food we eat is science. Everything we do is based on technology and science. So everybody should have access to understand that they are a scientist. You don't have to have, this is gonna blow y'all's mind. You don't have to have a PhD to be a scientist. Having a PhD is about power control. Academia is not the only place the science can be done. I'm running out of time and keep it moving, but y'all get the point. So how are you gonna engage communities that have these issues, right? Issues, what are issues? What are the impacts? What's the opportunities to work together? What's your why? You have to be transparent about your why. What are the benefits to working together? What are the partnerships that can come out of this work, right? And we think about environmental justice issues, so basically any issue we work on. You can connect to the food, faith, family, health, and jobs. That's what's proximal. That's what's everyday. That's what's pocketbook. Make your science, bring it to the people. Even with climate change, bring it to the people in the terms that make sense for them. In terms that they can, they can wrap their arms around. And that's how we can move forward in doing more impactful, more change science. Now, citizen science is something I do, but I know there's a lot of controversy around citizen science. So I was actually talking to a colleague recently about calling it public science, participatory science, because everybody's not a citizen. But here's some slides about citizen science, some text. It's just a way to marketize science, right? Street science, DIY science. It's a little bit different than CBPR. You have different types of citizen science, water quality monitoring, bird watching, et cetera. Citizen science is somewhat related to CBPR, but a little bit different. You can have contributory citizen science, collaborative, co-created. A lot of cases with traditional citizen science, community folk are not helping to develop the question, and the results are not disseminated by community folk. It's not really used for action, right? So it's still not really fully in the frame of CBPR or community-driven research, where communities are really driving the work and using that work for action, right? So you have community-based work that I do and crowd-based work. I also try to do, we want to connect the two. And so I think there's ways for us to kind of connect this like crowd science or crowd mapping, for example, with more place-based community science like CBPR or community-driven research. And also we talked about doing like the scaffolding, right? So I have a colleague Dr. Karen Cooper at NC State, who's trying to do this more like national scale work. And I work with her to kind of bring it down to the community scale. And so this is an important way for us to really bring science to everybody and actually try to fill the gaps in how science is done. Like, for example, we don't have enough regulatory monitors everywhere. A lot of our regulatory monitors are in background areas, but they're really giving us site-specific, very granular, data. So we are working to build a lot of hyper-local air quality monitor networks, but say if we do that across the country, have monitors in many places where you have hazards and have that kind of crowd source data, and then dig in locally to do more community-based specific research. We just submitted a grant proposal to NSF on January 11th that kind of sets that up. So citizen science, community science, if you want to call it that, is the way to empower folks, right? You build capacity, give people knowledge, and empower people. There's a lot of citizen science tools out there that I'm gonna kind of run through quickly. Just show a couple of examples. We are developing a US EPA EJ screen tool for Maryland called Maryland EJ screen. We can map environmental justice at the local level. So here's just a little bit example of that. If you want to learn more about those tools, you can go to ceejhlab.org/resources. So the idea is that our Maryland EJ screen tool will be adopted by state agencies. So when they're doing their permitting or enforcement or compliance work, or you want to figure out what communities have EJ issues, when we need to invest, think about President Biden's executive order on climate change. Think about the new infrastructure bill that's coming out. Think about even where coronavirus hotspots are. We actually have coronavirus data in our mapping tool. So you got to know, okay, where should we be vaccinating? Where should we be investing resources? Where should we be working with healthcare professionals? Where should we be engaging communities who are really overburdened by coronavirus? Remember I said before, the same communities overburdened by coronavirus are overburdened by climate change. So whether it be a biological disaster or a natural disaster, right, or a technological disaster, it's the same folks who really hit first, worst, and most, okay? So we have a park equity mapping tool that we worked on. And we also are working on a climate equity and health tool, which will be really useful, I think, with this new administration's work around climate change and climate equity. And, we got it in the Citizen Science Association, we talked a lot about increasing equity and inclusion. And I'm part of our JEDI committee, doing JEDI work with the association. And this is a picture with me with Omega Wilson, who's one of the leading advocates for this work within the Citizen Science Association. He's a member of the Environmental Justice Practitioners Working Group. And he's doing a lot of work trying to, again, change how science is done. Again, the question is science the key? It can be. Has it been? Not fully. Science has been part of the problem. The scientific industrial complex has been part of the problem. I wrote another blog on Medium about, as I talked about science of racism blog, about who's getting all the funding. in 2015, when you look at institutions of higher education, HBCUs receive less than 3% of federal funding. Now, that's a huge problem, y'all, because HBCUs produce more of our scientists of color, at least Black scientists, Black doctors, Black lawyers, than any other institutions do. Kamala Harris, right? Stacey Abrams, Senator Warner, right? Sacoby Wilson, HBCU grads, Michael Reagan, HBCU grad. You're producing a lot of folks, but we're not getting the funding, really? That's a form of science of imperialism. And why is that important? Because those institutions are also in many of these communities that have EJ issues. They're in these frontline fence-line communities, whether it be West Virginia State, whether it be Dillard University, Xavier University. You know, they're in communities with EJ issues. They should be getting funding because it's more efficient to build research and action work with those institutions that are in the communities that have the problems, particularly in Region 4. So real quickly, I just want to give you a couple of examples where I run out of time and take a couple of questions. I've done work with the Western Revitalization Association. Omega Wilson's president. Just quickly, y'all can look up papers on this work, so I don't have to go through all the slides. One of the big issues was plan of a highway without input of the community for multiple decades. And the fact that these communities were post-slavery Black communities. So one big issue with environmental injustice is communities been unincorporated, or they're unincorporated, or they're in the extraterritorial jurisdiction, so they're outside of the city limits. Usually they have no control over zoning and planning in those areas. So this is the same thing in the Ware neighborhoods. You had a lot of septic tank failure. Folks didn't have access to publicly regulated water. So you saw well water contamination. They were able to leverage this data to stop the highway from being built. They were able to leverage this data to get the first time sewer water installation. I did this work as a grad student. I still work with because I'm no longer a grad student, as y'all see, obviously. I've been working with them for over about 22 years. These communities were what we call pre-New Deal communities. These are things that the New Deal should have fixed with sewer and water and getting the roads paved, but because of racism, it didn't happen. So this is a form of environmental racism, y'all. It's not a made-up thing. Oh, environmental racism is not real. Environmental injustice is not real. No, it's a real thing. Worked in Ivy City in DC to help a community that's trying to stop a school bus depot from being put in their neighborhood. Near this historic Alexander Crummell School for students of color, folks of color. And so we've done air quality monitoring, measuring particular amount of Black carbon in that area. And we saw, high rates of pollution, PM 2.5 in this area above standards, right? EJ issues with CAFO. So a lot of my work is around concentrated animal feeding operations in North Carolina. So a lot of 10 million hogs in North Carolina, right? More hogs than people, maybe more people than hogs now. You have a lot of pollution associated with the spray fields, with the confinement houses, with the potential runoff in the well water. When a hurricane comes through, those berms can break. You have that waste, that solid waste and liquid waste can run off into well water. This slide was made by my mentor who passed away 5 years ago now, Steve Wing, that shows you where all the CAFOs are compared to people who were enslaved in 1860. Look at that, y'all. What's past is prologue. What the past impacts the present. The past history of slavery, people being freed, the Black Codes, Jim Crow, free folks having to live in the floodplains and the swamps because they weren't allowed to live as free people in cities with white folks. That's where a lot of these folks are. That's why a lot of folks in Region 4 in the hurricane zone are people of color, because they had to live in the floodplain, in the flood zones, okay? This is important to understand the history. And I don't use the word slavery in a frivolous way. It's an important term to ground us in the history of racism and bigotry and white supremacy, and how it plays itself out in where people have been overburdened today. How it plays itself out in with environmental racism and environmental law. Why the law is not protecting all of us equally. Like Dr. Bullock says, the complexion for protection. This is important. Hurricane Floyd, 1999, look what happened. Okay, Hurricane Florence. Look what happened. Again, farms flooded out, animals died, 11 trillion gallons of raindrop. Toxic soup, Katrina toxic soups, right? Hurricane Florence toxic soup people take it through. Hurricane Harvey toxic soup. It's important. So this work in the Gulf Coast, you have the Deep South Center working on climate change issues in the Gulf Coast. You know, working with HBCUs in the Gulf Coast, working in Houston, working in New Orleans, working in Biloxi, working in Africatown, in Mobile. You should know about Africatown, the last slave ship, the flotilla, working in Pensacola. HBCUs working communities to address issues around disasters and environmental justice. This is a model for how science should be done. So we're going to invest in, you know, scientists and universities and consortiums and best practices and models. This is a model that we should be uplifting, right? As a standard, as a gold standard. Last one, because I want to take a few questions. So Uniontown, Alabama is 20 miles from Selma, Alabama. You should know the history of Selma. You know, John Lewis, Edmund Pettus Bridge. Again, there's connections with the civil rights movement. I didn't say this earlier. The environmental justice movement in many ways is a child of the civil rights movement. Black Lives Matter movement is a child of the civil rights movement. But all these movements are streams of the human rights movement, the global human rights movement, whether it be, you know, immigrants' rights, fight against new slavery, right? Fight against trafficking, fighting for LGBTQ rights, right? Fighting against Islamophobia, remembering the Holocaust and fighting for, you know, folks in Palestine, right? There's two sides of that. But we should be fighting against injustice. There's different forms of injustice. Fighting for human dignity, right? Uniontown. This is a community where the per capita income is less than $12,000 a year. Extremely poor. You know, that mountain you see is not a mountain. That's 4 million tons of coal ash. They have a landfill that takes in waste, I think, from 33 states, and they also take in special waste. So coal ash is special waste. They have a catfish factory, catfish ponds, a cheese plant and cheese effluent then sprayed on the ground. And one of the most egregious things that's happening in Uniontown, they don't have really good sewer and water infrastructure. So when they flush their toilet, unlike you, when you flush your toilet, their waste goes to a containment pond and they spray that waste on the ground. So what you see being sprayed is human waste. That pond you see is a pond of human waste. That landfill was built on top of an old plantation cemetery, right? So you think about environmental injustice. Don't care about your dead. I don't care about your dead, don't care about your living, okay? And so we've been working with communities to fight against this, building a hyperlocal air quality monitoring network. I have more slides to show. Doing work in Curtis Bay to help them fight against an incinerator a few years ago. I'll just show us a little bit. That's another example of a quintessential EJ community dealing with major super polluters, goods movement issues, you know, ships coming in to Baltimore. You have the traffic, diesel truck traffic, you know, rail traffic. They have open coal piles. They have a waste incinerator. They have a medical waste incinerator. They're going to build the largest incinerator country called Energy Answers. And we fought to help them stop that. This community was really poor. Think about median household income, look at the state rate compared to the nation. I mean, so you think about environmental justice, you got these underlying disparities, social disparities, you know, so the income disparities, y'all. And so people get dumped on, they become sacrifices on. So where's science at and stepping up and stepping in? Just not documenting the problem or looking at mechanisms or going inside the body. The solutions are outside the body. How is science becoming more political? You know, all these scientists got woke during the Trump administration. Well, were they woke for the right reasons? I think most people got woke because they're about to lose their money. That's not selfishness, that's selfishness. How is our science being selfless in helping to support these communities and helping to document their problems, but giving the tools and the resources that can be empowered to address the issue? That's how science can be the key. That's how all of us as scientists who have a piece or not can be the key. And so I'm going to end here because I'm really over time. I'm sorry it took so long. I got too in my head. But I just want to say to this group who's listening to this presentation today that we have to do more. Science can do more. It's just not good enough now to say you cannot. I didn't get back to this point. Hide behind objectivity. I'm gonna say this: there's no truly objective science. What I mean by that is all of us have our own lenses, our values, our assumptions, our biases, our experiences that drive the science that we do. Being transparent about that is important. That can lead to more objectivity, but that's there. And rigor is also important, but who defines what's subjective and who defines what's rigorous? That's another problem that we have to think about when it's science actually the key. Because that gets back to me, power control again. So who's making those decisions? Who is making those decisions? The power issue is really, really important. And we need to address power differentials. We have to change the culture of academia and change the culture of science so that science can truly be the key to addressing and addressing environmental injustice and advancing social justice, racial justice, and environmental justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. I do think we have time for a few questions if anyone has any questions. But please join me in giving Dr. Wilson a hand. Maybe we can just use our little reaction emoji things.
I saw a question from Joel. Joel, so I was on the board of CCPH. I forgot to mention, I'm currently on the board of the Citizens Association. I'm sorry, I need like another hour, like I said. But CCPH back in 2009 developed 10 promotion guidelines for community engaged research. So if you want, that's a place to start to integrate some of that into your promotion tenure guidelines at Emory. Also, you can look at UNC Charlotte or UNC Greensboro, I believe, and the University of Washington also has done some things with their guidelines. And then, as I said earlier in my presentation, George Washington, they do have a fourth category, practice, in their guidelines as well.
Are there any more questions? I was really intrigued by the way you talked about the completeness of the science we're doing, and it's something that really kind of hit home to me. And I'm going to have to go back and look at the research I'm doing and making sure that we're completing all aspects of science, or trying to focus on all aspects of science. But certainly a lot of what you said, I think, is going to be applicable to the work that many of us do. And so I'm very appreciative that you took the time to speak with us and give this amazing and timely presentation. And thanks a lot. Dr. Wilson, are there any other questions? Oh, I see some coming up here. Can you offer an example of best practice for being transparent about the lens?
Yeah, so when you're going into community, usually community groups I work with, they don't actually come to me directly. They come to me through like a law firm or like Earth Justice, or legal group like Earth Justice, or they come to like a green. They know because they have a bigger brand, right? Or they're seen as more value to them or more credible than academia. That may be part of that. Remember I talked about the baggage issue? That may be part of the reason why they go into these folks first instead of coming to us. But what I try to do is, when you think about the transparency of the lens, at least from the community engagement side, I come in like, I may have a research grant, being transparent about that, or I may have certain questions I want to have answered, being transparent about that, or say, hey, I'm on the promotion, I'm on promotion track, I'm on the tenure track, and I want to get some papers out. I want to do research with you, but can you help me with that? I think that transparency is important, but also when you get back to the different way to answer your question about your lens, I think in academia, we grind out individuality and we grind out culture. That is the reason why I got into the PhD. So I can actually get skill sets and go back to solve the problems. But what happens is that when you bring it into academia, sometimes that's seen as not being objective, or working in communities is seen as being as rigorous science. I think working in communities is some of the hardest science that you would do, because dealing with people, y'all know how dealing with people. I mean, I don't say anything bad, but you know how you deal with your family. Let's say the family. It's hard to deal with some family members. Apply it to a community context, right? It's hard doing that work. So that work needs to be more valued. And I think in that lens, if we can value that cultural expertise that people bring in, and that's where diversity and inclusion comes in, I think we can create a better climate and better atmosphere so students don't feel lost. They don't feel like they're less than or otherwise. They don't feel marginalized. They don't deal with imposter syndrome. They don't have to like code switch all the time. They can be who they are. Whether it be someone who's part of the LGBT community who's also indigenous, or there's so much diversity out there, and that diversity enriches the research. But we have the tendency to really demean or undervalue that diversity. And just as a quick highlight, for those of you in the PhD program, please apply to the Robert Wood Johnson's health policy program, health policy scholars program. The reason why I mentioned in the context of this question, that program is so diverse: race, ethnicity, immigrant status, orientation, language. They actually support it, they nurture it, they celebrate it. And that's the kind of environments we have to create in academia, where we celebrate the diversity and let it inform the science that we do. So we get better questions and get better research and get better outcomes.
Melanie, I think we have time for your question.
Okay, thank you so much for that talk. So my question is, obviously Emory is a predominantly white institution. And for a lot of our scientists who are also white and are thinking about doing community engaged research, how do we address the racism, that's at our institution, that's part of science and things like that when we're going out to try to develop these relationships?
It's hard. I mean, I would say, being white it's not a bad thing. I mean, I go into the Black communities, I put both feet in my mouth. I can tell stories if I have more time. I just put one of my community partners in Charleston, the Low Country Alliance for All Communities. I was working on all this great work with Omega is a leading, national EJ expert. It's like, we're gonna do what we did in Mebane, right? And they looked at me like I was crazy. It took me some time to kind of just unwind, like take the left foot out and the right foot out. So you have to understand the context. You gotta build that trust. You gotta understand that's baggage. And regardless if you're white, being an academic, that's gonna be baggage. And what's Emory's relationships with local communities? I mean, what's Emory's relationship with, working with other universities in the region? You got the AU Center, you got Georgia State. How are we really, putting policy and solutions first? So focusing on solutions and policy change and solving the problems are gonna be really sort of instrumental in you being able to change the way the community partners look at you. So the research is important, but remember I said the 5 dimensions of science, it just doesn't be discovery science. It has to be, you have to have engagement science, you have to have application science. And by creating those conditions and really building those relationships, and it may take time. I mean, sometimes, and I know we're running out of time, we're out of time, we're over time. Sometimes you may have a research question, but what they need is not research. It may be a service. We got kids who got asthma. How we can make sure they get more inhalers? So your ability to bring in other resources and partners to help address them like holistically is one way to help empower them. So no, you're not just there for your research project. You're there for, it's a whole community approach. Hopefully that helps answer that question. And it's hard though.
It does, thank you.
Well, thanks again, Dr. Wilson. We really appreciate it. And again, thank you for your time and the outstanding presentation. And thanks everyone for attending.
Hey, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
If you have questions,
Bye-bye.
just email me. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.